Chapter 14. Not even a backward glance, she thought, miffed, as she paced about the room. How am I to pass the time without losing my mind? She wondered for the umpteenth time. She was still in the billiards room. With a decisive nod, she strode to the wall and rang for her maid. She was quickly joined by Pansy. "Thank you for coming so swiftly." "How can I be of service, milady? Whatever I can do, I will be happy to." "Play billiards with me." It was obvious this was not what the maid had been expecting. "My lady?" she questioned. "I am going to go out of my mind with worry and frustration over being left behind. While I understand the Earl's reasons for refusing to allow me to accompany him, I cannot just sit here quietly and await his return. I need help to stay occupied." Pansy giggled at her mistress's words. "That is understandable, my lady, but I have never even attempted the game. And are you sure you should be playing such a game with your arm still bandaged?" Elizabeth dismissed her concerns with a wave of her hand. "I am perfectly fine, and it is not a problem that you do not know how to play. I have just learned myself. I can show you what I know already, and we can practice together. It will serve the Earl well if I can trounce him at this game when he returns." Their nerves lent a degree of hysteria to their levity, but they more easily passed the time while they played the game. Before she knew it, the housekeeper was inquiring if her ladyship would be taking supper. "Oh, Mrs. Patrick, is it that time already? I am delighted to hear it. Thank you, Pansy, for your help in getting through the afternoon." Elizabeth turned back to the housekeeper. "I dare say I shan't be able to eat very much, but no doubt I ought to give it a try. I do hope the dining table has not been set formally. As the Earl has not yet returned, I would just as rather have a tray in my room." "Very well, milady. I figured as much. Would now be a good time?" Elizabeth glanced out the window, surprised to see that darkness was gathering. She chewed on her lip in concern for the men out searching for the villains, hoping they would return shortly. "Shall we say in half an hour? I might as well get comfortable first." "Very well, milady." Uncharacteristically, the usually talkative housekeeper had little to say. Elizabeth realized the entire household was on edge. With her maid in tow, Elizabeth made her way to her room. "I had thought to get into bed, but I doubt if I shall sleep a wink, and I would rather be up and dressed in case I am needed." "You mustn't run yourself ragged, milady. Keep in mind you have barely left your sickbed from being shot." "I appreciate your concern, Pansy, and you are right. I will try not to overtax myself, but I know I will be too restless for a while yet." The maid subsided from her protests. Before too long, Elizabeth's supper was served. Contrary to what she had expected, she was able to eat a good portion of the delicious food, relieved that the cook had made a light, tempting meal. The time continued to drag. She succumbed to Pansy's urgings and lay down on the bed with a book, but refused to get into her nightclothes. Elizabeth was alarmed to see the warm sunlight streaming through a gap in her curtains the next morning. She had a slight crick in her neck from the uncomfortable position she had slumped into when she fell asleep reading the night before. Sitting up, she cast her gaze around the room. Her faithful maid was asleep, slumped over in a chair nearby, obviously having remained by her side throughout the night. The slight stir Elizabeth made as she swung her legs over the side of the bed brought Pansy to alertness. She sprang from the chair. "What's happening?" Elizabeth grinned at her sleepy tone. "Nothing that I know of, unfortunately, Pansy. It looks as though the men have not yet returned." Seeing the maid wince, she continued. "It would appear that we both fell asleep waiting up, and have stiff necks in return for our troubles. If you would like to run to your own chamber and freshen up, I can have another maid assist me." Pansy was appalled at the suggestion. "I shall not leave your side, my lady." She didn't bother insisting, as she was comforted by the maid's presence. They made quick work of getting the Countess freshened up. She was just getting fastened into a gown when they heard a commotion coming from the floor below. "Hurry, Pansy, that must be him." Elizabeth was suddenly frantic to get to her husband's side. "My lady, you must stand still. If I don't get this sash tied, you're sure to trip over it, and have a broken neck to show for your troubles." The high pitch of Elizabeth's giggles over her maid's attempt at humour demonstrated just how nervous she had been over the Earl's longer-than-expected absence. Finally, Pansy was done, and Elizabeth could rush from the room. The hallway had never felt so long as she tried and failed for decorum. She admonished herself to be careful. Pansy was right. A broken neck from tumbling down the stairs would be just what they needed to complete the chaos. But she couldn't bear to slow her steps. When she finally got to the top of the staircase, she could see Justice in the foyer, surrounded by some of his men. He glanced up. His wide grin reached his eyes, their warm invitation glinting up at her. Elizabeth hurried down the stairs and into her husband's waiting arms. She accepted his comfort for a moment, but then pulled back, and after a searching gaze to ensure he appeared to be in one piece, she hit him in the shoulder with the fist of her own good arm. "Where have you been, my lord? We have been worried sick about you." The Earl grinned at her while looking her over carefully. "You appear hale and hearty, my lady. Not at all like you have spent a sleepless night pacing the floors." Hot colour rose in her cheeks, and she bashfully admitted, "I fell asleep while waiting up for you. It could not be helped." "Of course not, my dear. I would never have wanted you to stay up all night." "But you did," she protested. "Now you must tell me everything." He tucked her under his shoulder and dismissed his men before pulling her into the front receiving room. Before he could begin recounting the events of the night, she pulled on his hand. "Are you absolutely certain that you are unharmed, my lord? I am sure the doctor would be happy to stop by and look you over." The Earl smiled over her words, but assured her, "There's not a scratch on me, my dear. I promise you. As you shall soon find out, the entire night was rather anticlimactic. We were able to catch both the missing footman and Hector without any difficulty. My cousin, it turns out, is a complete coward. That would explain why he targeted my wife instead of me. We took him down without any struggle on his part." Elizabeth nodded over his words. "That makes sense, now that I think of it. He is despicable for attacking you in such an underhanded way." "Well, you needn't give him another thought, my dear. He is on his way to Botany Bay as we speak. That is what actually took so long. We escorted him to the coast ourselves." "I didn't think murder was a transportable crime." "You are right, it is not. But Hector wasn't actually the one who killed Barbara. He actually paid her footman to do it. That cretin has been entrusted to the care of the courts. My cousin may be despicable, but he is still a member of my family, and I feel a degree of responsibility toward him. I should have recognized his hatred for what it was and prevented his involvement with Brodrick. The entire situation sickens me, but I am certain his vileness is due to Brodrick's influence." "There is no way you could have foreseen his actions," Elizabeth protested. He waved aside her words and continued his explanations. "Be that as it may, I could not hand him over along with the footman. But he is certainly not in for a comfortable future. He will be sentenced to at least 7 years. It is doubtful he will ever return to England." "I cannot decide if I think that is too harsh or too lenient," Elizabeth exclaimed. "What if he comes after you again 10 years from now?" "He won't. I promise you." "You actually cannot promise me in that, my lord. Will he not feel he has even more reason to hate you after spending 7 to 10 years in exile?" "He agreed to being deported, my dear. I think the experience will either kill him or reform him. I firmly believe we shall have nothing more to fear from the despicable Hector." They searched each other's gazes, seeking comfort. Elizabeth broke the moment with her next words. Even though she was weary from the ups and downs of the past weeks, and was reluctant to bring an issue into their comfortable silence, she did so anyway. "There is one more thing that is of concern, though." "What else is troubling you, my dear lady?" She almost didn't say when she looked into his warm gaze, but after swallowing to moisten her suddenly dry throat, she proceeded. We have not apprehended Sir Brodrick. Have you heard back from Wrentham? Justice sighed. Not yet. You are right to be concerned. I would have preferred to have him in my own hands, but I was much more interested in apprehending Hector, as he was the one behind the threat to you and Barbara. There is no evidence to suggest that Brodrick is the murderous sort. They heard a slight sound behind them just before someone said, "That is where you would be wrong, my lord." Elizabeth and Justice whirled toward the windows, which had been left ajar to allow in some of the unseasonably warm air. There stood Sir Jason Brodrick, with a pistol pointed straight at them. He must have climbed through one of the tall windows. It would not have been difficult, as they were on the main floor of the house. Justice was quick to stand in front of Elizabeth. "What do you want, Brodrick? Why are you here?" Justice sounded calm but fierce, as he glared at the knight, who didn't appear to be bothered by the Earl's obvious displeasure. "And why aren't you locked up?" Elizabeth demanded from behind Justice's back. She was trying to get around him to face their opponent, but the Earl would not allow it. "Didn't Wrentham apprehend you after what you did to Rose?" Broderick's gleeful chuckle sent a chill of dread down Elizabeth's back. "That young cub was rather easy to get away from. I do hate to repeat myself, Brodrick, but I must again ask you, why are you here?" Elizabeth couldn't believe that her husband actually sounded bored as he asked the question. She marvelled at his ability to keep such control of himself. "As I have no wish to have my neck stretched, and my plans have been foiled for the time being, I find I am in need of funds in order to make a fresh start. Your wife's baubles will do nicely." When Brodrick heard Elizabeth's gasp of outrage, he smiled with wicked amusement. "Not your debutante pearls. My girl, do not trouble yourself. Barbara was quite enamoured with the various gems her father had showered her with. I need them." Broderick's tone and manner both hardened as he spoke, as though he had been making an effort to appear pleasant, but it was growing difficult for him to maintain. "Really, Brodrick? I think you truly have run mad if you think I would help you in any way after all that you have done." If the situation weren't so dire, Elizabeth would be amused by the incredulity evident in Justice's voice. Any thought of amusement was wiped from her mind by Broderick's next words. "Well, I could just shoot you, and then your new little wife could help me." Brodrick waved the gun at them, gesturing for them to move toward the doorway. "I am quite certain Barbara mentioned you kept her jewels locked up for her in your library. Shall we go and see?" His voice was again overly sweet, but Elizabeth could see that he was merely being sarcastic. "I shan't trouble you too much. If you would just hurry along and fetch me what I'm after, I can be on my way and you needn't spare me another thought." Justice backed up as Brodrick stepped toward them. There was a slight movement behind the knight, as though the drapery were fluttering, but Elizabeth barely noticed as she had her attention solely focused on the pistol in Broderick's outstretched arm. It felt as though her heart were beating in her throat. She was racking her brain, trying to come up with a plan of action. Suddenly, Brodrick toppled over, and the Duke of Wrentham stood over him with a bookend in his hand. "Thanks for keeping him occupied until I was able to get control of the situation." Elizabeth knew her jaw hung open, but she struggled to comprehend what had just happened. Her eyes flickered between Justice, who had finally allowed her out from behind him, and the newly arrived Duke. "Did you know he was here?" she demanded. "Not at first, but did you not notice the curtains moving?" At the shake of her head, Justice continued, after putting his arm around her gently. "I noticed his boots below the drapes, and chose not to bring Broderick's attention to them. I didn't actually realize it was Wrentham, but I figured someone was there with the intention of assisting us." Seeing that his wife was somewhat mollified and regaining her composure, he turned his attention to the Duke. I guess you must have received my message. Justice finally answered the Duke's statement with a grin. He has been leading me a merry chase for the last couple of days. Now that we have him again, I will see to it myself that he dances at the end of a rope. The Duke bowed in Elizabeth's direction. I apologize for being so blunt, my lady. Oh, pay me no mind, your grace. I shan't be sorry to see the end of him. She tried to put on a brave face, but hoped the Duke would be quick about departing with his wicked captive. It crossed her mind to wonder if she ought to offer the Duke hospitality. She would be happy to, under normal circumstances, but she quite hoped to be rid of the nobleman at this time. Thankfully, he took the situation out of her hands. Justice was making short work of tying Brodrick's hand with the ties from the drapery. He stood over the prone figure and asked the Duke what else he could do to help. I have about a dozen men outside, Sinclair, waiting to support me, so I do think that will be sufficient. Once again, I appreciate your assistance. I dare say I shall have to pay you a visit when my wife can accompany me. Until then, I will bid you adieu. Shockingly, when Elizabeth glanced at the clock, she realized it hadn't even been a half-hour since they had been confronted by Sir Brodrick. She was certain she could be quite content with no more drama for at least the next decade. Justice helped the Duke carry their foe from the room, but he quickly returned. She was still standing in the same spot where he had left her. He pulled her toward him into a warm hug, holding her close and rubbing her back for a moment, before leaning back and searching her gaze. Are you quite all right, my dear? She offered him a shaky smile. I do believe so. None of this has been an experience I would care to repeat, but it would seem that all our cares have been looked after. There was a slight pause as Elizabeth allowed the Earl to draw her toward the settee, after he had poured himself a glass of brandy. She arranged her skirts quickly and grasped his hand once more. Fidgeting with their fingers, needing a few more minutes and several deep breaths to calm the shaking that had set in after the fright had passed, she was grateful that Justice sat peacefully by her side, allowing her the time she needed to regain her composure. She could have used a few more minutes or hours, but then he broke the silence. Now that it would seem we are once more safe, there are a few things we need to clear up between the two of us. Would you not agree, my dear? Elizabeth felt the colour ebb and flow from her face at his words. She hung her head, embarrassed over her previous assumptions about her husband. Don't look like that, my dear. You have nothing to be ashamed of. I am just as guilty of being suspicious. I will admit to you that I had briefly suspected that you were complicit in your ruination. For that I offer my sincere apologies. It had seemed just a little too convenient how quickly we were caught together. But I fully understand why you suspected me of being involved in my wife's murder. It took a great deal of courage for you to marry me anyway. Elizabeth smiled and shrugged. It was not as though my mother gave me any choice. She hesitated for a moment, but then was compelled to ask, When did you accept that I had nothing to do with us being found in a compromising situation? She was curious to know. He chuckled. When I realized that you truly believed that I had killed Barbara. No lady of sound mind would arrange to be compromised into marriage with someone she feared might kill her. Finding out that you were questioning the servants about Barbara's death, and that you actually suspected me, was the final piece of evidence I needed. Of course, getting to know you was quite convincing as well. You are one of the most straightforward ladies I have met. Tricking me into marriage would be out of character for you, in my opinion. Why, thank you, my lord. She dimpled at him. Now there is something else we must discuss. I am starting to find it terribly irritating to have you constantly so formal with me. Can you not find it within yourself to call me Justice? Or even Sinclair or Heath would be preferable. Elizabeth was gratified by his complaint, but resisted momentarily. But, my lord, Was it not one of the things I vowed to do when we married? I thought I was being deeply respectful." She could feel his searching gaze and tried to keep her face innocent. She burst into a fit of giggles when his serious face broke into a grin. "You had me almost believing your words for a moment," he chuckled. Glancing at him from beneath her lashes, Elizabeth smiled. "I had no wish to be on informal terms when I could not be certain if I could trust you, but I would be happy to call you Justice. And now, Justice, I am quite ready to get on with living. I am very happy to have a future to look forward to with you." Justice stood up and pulled her into the circle of his arms, flush against his body. They both seemed to revel in the moment, savouring life. His search of her gaze was brief but thorough. He must have been satisfied to see that she welcomed his embrace. He kept one hand at the small of her back, holding her close, while his other hand tunnelled into her hair. Elizabeth could hear pins fall, but couldn't be bothered by it. Of their own volition, her hands imitated his. One hand held onto his shoulder, while her other furrowed into his thick hair. Her tummy tumbled at the sensations coursing through her, and his lips hadn't even touched hers yet. He hovered for a moment, their breath mingled. Elizabeth could almost taste the brandy he had been sipping. She felt drunk on the spirits she had not imbibed. Finally, his lips touched hers. A delicious shiver slithered down her spine and into her legs. If not for his arms around her, she doubted they would have kept her standing. She wanted to analyze the moment, but all further thought flew from her head as he firmed his lips and deepened the kiss. Time stood still. Moments later he pulled back, as though he realized they were still in a rather public area of the house. It seemed as though he were thinking of escorting her to his room. Her expressive face could rarely hide her intentions. "What are you plotting now, my dear?" he asked. "No plots, my lord, but I am happy to have satisfied my curiosity on one more score." "And that is?" he prompted. "The first night I met you, I had to struggle against the most inconvenient impulse to touch your hair. I am happy to note that it really is as soft as it appears." Justice joined her in laughing with delight as he guided her from the room. Happily ever after had been arranged. Epilogue. 1 year later. Elizabeth strolled along the path in the now barren orchard, relieved that the fair weather was holding. "I am so glad you are able to come for a visit, despite the fact that winter is approaching." Her dear friend Rosamond, now the Duchess of Wrentham, laughed. "Well, I assured his Grace that I would be unbearable if he did not bring me. He wouldn't allow it while I was increasing, and then when the baby was so new. He still didn't love the idea, but I refused to wait until spring, so here we are. Now, tell me, are you truly as happy as you appear?" Elizabeth grinned at her friend, who sounded as though she was still as managing as ever. "I am, actually. Perhaps even happier than I appear." Her hand dropped briefly to caress her growing belly. "I can fully imagine the Duke refusing to bring you before. Sinclair will barely let me out of his sight now that I'm in an interesting condition." Rose trilled another laugh. "Who would have thought you would find such joy with the Earl of Heath? But of course, now that you know he didn't kill his first wife, I guess all there is to focus on is all that handsomeness." Elizabeth's smile was private. "Well, there are a great many things to focus on," she said while blushing. Turning the subject quickly, she said, "Speaking of uncomfortable topics, you really must tell me everything before our husbands rejoin us. What really happened the night you were abducted? I never wanted to address it fully in a letter, but you really must tell me. Do you realize that was the fateful night that I became embroiled with Sinclair?" "Well, I am delighted that so much good came out of such a sticky situation. If not for Brodrick, neither of us would be where we are today." They had come to a bench, and Elizabeth gratefully sank down onto it. It was good that they had dressed warmly. Despite the unusually fair weather, there was still a nip in the air. She nodded in acknowledgement of Rose's words. "I know. I cannot find it in my heart to hate the man, despite his schemes and machinations. Of course, I never truly had dealings with him. Even the night that he came here demanding the Countess's jewels, he only pointed his gun at Sinclair, not me. Of course, I was terrified at the time, but after everything, I cannot say that I think he is evil. Merely diabolically misdirected." Rose rolled her eyes. "You always were one to see the good in everything, but with the passage of time, I have been able to let go of most of my ill will toward the man. I still bear a small scar on my wrist from where it was rubbed raw by the ropes he tied me up with, so I cannot say I will ever be able to forget about him. But I got away within hours of the abduction." She lowered her voice and glanced around, ensuring that there was no one within earshot. "I have to tell you, the look on Rentham's face when I came running out of that dreadful building was priceless. I dare say he was disappointed that I had managed to save myself. Of course, I will admit, I have no idea how I would have gotten myself safely out of that part of town, so it was good that he showed up when he did. I am so glad that nothing worse happened to you. It's too bad that you bear scars. It would be better if you could forget it. But as you say, it brought the two of you together, so the memories can't all be bitter." Rose returned her smile. "Not at all bitter, my friend. But you must tell me, how did Brodrick come to be free after that? I would have thought Rentham would have torn him limb from limb. I rather thought he was going to as well, but the man has self-control of steel." She shook her head, but Elizabeth could see the warm twinkle of appreciation in her friend's eye when she thought of her husband. "Of course, when Rentham found Brodrick the second time, I cannot say he was gentle with him. But since your husband was so quick to tie him up, Rentham couldn't, as a gentleman, pummel him as he wished." The two were quiet for a moment before Elizabeth asked with a tentative tone to her voice, "Is the matter truly closed now that Brodrick has been eliminated?" Rose sighed and shook her head. "Unfortunately, there will always be plots against the government and our king. But with Brodrick gone, this particular threat has been eliminated." Rose shook off her serious mien and grinned. "It is such a shame the man was a traitor. With his brilliant mind, Brodrick would have been very useful to the Home Office." Elizabeth wrinkled her nose. "Even after all that he has done, you still think he's brilliant?" "Using women to manipulate their husbands into doing as he wished with the government?" Rose asked. "It could have worked rather well if he had chosen different subjects, and we cannot be completely certain that he wasn't successful with many others. Brodrick refused to divulge anything. He took his secrets with him to his grave. If Rentham and Sinclair had not testified against him, he actually might have gotten away with it. The methods he used kept him quite safe from blame. It could be argued that he never forced anyone to do anything." There was a brief pause while Elizabeth gazed at her friend with rapt attention. Rose continued, "Really, if not for his abducting me and then threatening your husband, it would have been impossible to tie him to any plots. Why do you suppose he took such a risk as to abduct you? If he was as brilliant as you think, surely he must have realized it would lead to no good." Rose shrugged. "He had either gotten too complacent or too desperate." Her serious face broke into a wide grin as she glanced down the path toward the house and saw their husbands walking toward them. Rentham had a small bundle in his arms. "Now, never mind about all this. Is that not the most beautiful baby you have ever seen?" Elizabeth, too, dismissed the worrisome topic and returned her friend's smile as she once again placed a gentle hand on her rounded belly. "He is quite lovely. But I have a sneaking suspicion that he will soon be replaced as most beautiful in my eyes." Rose nodded. "You are wise, my friend, to realize that. I never knew I would feel like this about a baby." She reached over and clasped Elizabeth's hand. "I do hope you are having a boy. It would be brilliant if they could grow up together as the best of friends." Elizabeth nodded, her eyes welling with tears as she squeezed her friend's hand. "Or if it's a girl, we could always play matchmaker." By then the gentleman had arrived and heard Elizabeth's last words. They exchanged wry glances. Justice was the first to speak. "Trust the women to already be planning the babies' lives." He turned and shook his head at his wife. "Surely you don't want to turn into your mother?" he teased, although she could hear the loving laughter in his voice. Despite the fact that he was jesting, Elizabeth was much struck by his words and could not contain her laughter. "Perish the thought! You are correct as usual, my lord. Whoever this child turns out to be, I shall love him or her, and do my utmost to allow him to make of his life as he wishes." She paused for a moment, but then had to add, "Of course, I may have to provide a gentle nudge here or there." The four friends shared in uproarious laughter before returning to the house to continue their visit. This has been The Countess Intrigue, written by Wendy May Andrews, narrated by Julie Hinton. Copyright 2016 by Wendy May Andrews.